I welcome Sara to give evidence as the Lead Commissioner for Countering Extremism. Could you just set out for us first what you see as being the most important parts of your role and what you are prioritising at the moment?
Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me to give evidence today, Chair. I want to briefly just set out, in order to answer your question, the work of the Commission. I was appointed in January. The Commission was formally launched in March. I bring to this role 10 years' worth of grassroots experience, having run a women's NGO, a women's counter-extremism NGO. The Commission launched in March, as I said, and engagement underpins everything that the Commission does. So over that length of time, I have visited around 13 towns and cities across England and Wales. I've spoken to about 400 experts and activists and civil society groups and others. And I've also set up an expert group to specifically advise and challenge the work of the Commission. The aim of the Commission is to help everyone do more to challenge extremism. I believe that extremism is a whole society problem, and it therefore requires a whole society response. And we've set out, as is outlined in the Commission's Charter, the key objectives for this first year, which is to engage widely, is to produce a wide-ranging study into extremism, looking at all forms of extremism, and thirdly, to go back to the Home Secretary and highlight and identify key recommendations on what role the Commission should play, what should be its long-term function, its structure, and so forth. We published last month the terms of reference for the study. There are 5 key themes that we want to look at. That includes the scale of extremism in our country, the harms that extremism is having in our country, understanding and analysing the objectives and wider evolving tactics of extremists, understanding the public's perception of extremism, and finally looking at the government's response to extremism in particular, and also possibly reviewing their definition as well. So we've been very busy. We've held workshops with both supporters and critics alike, and it's been very, very insightful. But I suppose for me personally, what I've found really interesting is going around the country and hearing people's experiences of extremism. And I have to say that people in this country are deeply concerned about what they perceive to be rising extremism.
Can you talk about how far your focus is on Islamist extremism and how far on far-right extremism?
I've made clear that this Commission has to look at all forms of extremism. So we know that the greatest threats come from both Islamist and the far right, but I've also spoken to academics, practitioners and others who have specialism in hard left extremism, Sikh extremism, Hindu extremism, and so I'm very keen to look at it in a very broad way, because I think if you do it that way, you start to see similar tactics that extremists employ. You start to see similar objectives that extremists use, and so I think that's really important. And again, I feel that having spoken to, for example, members of the Sikh community who are deeply concerned about what they perceive to be Sikh extremism, the intimidation and bullying that's happening within and among different Sikh communities, that's something that we should also look at. I feel the Commission has a responsibility to look at all forms of extremism.
Kate Green.
You said a moment ago that you see tackling extremism as an issue for the whole of society, and indeed that's a message that was echoed recently by the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, who, in response to the report that he had commissioned on tackling extremism and hate speech, spoke about the wish in Greater Manchester to develop a new whole society approach. What do you think are the characteristics of such an approach?
I think he's right, that we have to have a whole society approach to it. Sir Mark Rowley, the former Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, also very much argued this point. Extremism impacts all of us, and it's one of those issues which crosses over into so many different areas. So I see the role of schools and education, for example, is vital. Teaching children critical thinking skills is important. Teaching children about equality and human rights and diversity, again, helping to build resilience amongst young children is important. So schools and teachers have an incredibly important role to play. Faith leaders, and many of them are doing fantastic work in challenging extremism, challenging ideological narratives using theology. I've seen that in practice and I've seen how effective that is. Government, of course, has a role to play. The government has published a counter-extremism strategy back in 2015. There's a top-down approach, but of course there's the bottom-up approach, which is the civil society response as well. What can civil society organisations be doing? And again, I've met incredible civil society groups who are either really actively exposing and challenging extremists, or those organisations which are working to build resilience. What I would say is that, having spoken to a number of different civil society organisations over the last few months, just how much abuse they get for doing this work, the hostility, the backlash, for people who are actively trying to challenge extremism, challenging bigotry and hatred. And there's a really hostile climate out there facing counter-extremists. And others who then say to me, we know that the work that you're saying we need to do is important, but when we look at the climate that exists out there, we don't want to put our head above the parapet. So I want to look at what more can we do to enable, empower and support counter-extremists, who I believe are the backbone of our country and our unsung heroes.
I'd like to come back to that in a moment, but first of all, can I ask you, you talked about schools having a role, education, civil society, all of which I think we would agree with, but you'll be aware, I'm sure, that in the report that was commissioned by Andy Burnham, one of the things that his commission identified was the real importance of investment in community resources. It highlighted in that report, for example, the lack of youth provision, which was having a detrimental effect on young people and therefore the potential for them to be drawn into terrorist activity. It noted that reductions in public services have increased isolation and really separation within and between communities. Do you agree that that is an issue, that underinvestment in public services, and is that a point you're raising with government?
I've obviously heard a number of these different concerns, particularly around youth. I was in Portsmouth recently, where a youth worker was telling me that he worked with very, very vulnerable kids who are the type of kids who are going to be drawn into violence, knife crime, gang crime, possibly even being killed. And so he's working with those type of children. And he said to me that he feels that firstly organisations like his don't receive enough funding and enough support. And also he felt that if the far right, and I quote, actually got their act together in his particular area, he feels he would have lost a generation of young kids. This is something that I am deeply concerned about. One of the things that we want to examine as part of the study is a cross-cutting theme, which is the drivers of extremism. So a lot of those issues, I think, will come up as we are gathering evidence over the next 6 months, something that we will be examining and looking at. I have to say, on the issue of around poverty and things like that, the evidence shows us that the picture is very complex. There is no single answer. We've seen how people from middle-class families who are very well educated, who've been to university, who are quite wealthy, have been drawn into extremism. And likewise, people who come from perhaps working-class backgrounds or families don't necessarily end up in extremism. So the picture is very complex, but it's something that we want to examine as part of our study.
When you talked a few moments ago about your 5 priorities, they came across as being very focused on behaviours around extremism and the ways in which people become drawn into extremist activity. There didn't seem to be much focus on these community engagement strategies and the way in which communities need to have the resources to support one another and to have confidence and trust between each other. You've now said that that is something, I think, that you're taking an interest in, but why is it not explicit in these 5 priorities?
I mean, I feel it is. I suppose in terms of the idea around understanding extremist ideas and behaviour, I would put those under theme 1, which is the public's understanding of extremism. The other themes, for example, looking at the scale of extremism, is looking at particular indicators which will highlight to us, for example, the relationship between hate crime and extremism, the understanding attitudes that people may have towards extremism, looking at incidences in regulated schools such as charities and other regulated spaces. So trying to get that information in terms of scale. But in terms of community engagement, we are asking the public to contribute to our public call for evidence. We're launching the first ever consultation because I believe passionately that we should give the people in this country an opportunity to tell us what they're experiencing in their areas. What do they feel is contributing to extremism, either that they're experiencing as individual, but also what they're seeing in their towns and cities. And we're going to be holding a number of different community engagement events. And as I said, I've been travelling around the country and speaking to people because, I feel very strongly that we need to hear from people themselves. And people have given me a whole range of different ideas of what they feel is driving extremism. But that kind of speaking to victims, speaking to counter-extremists, speaking to local authorities. I've had a number of productive meetings with the LGA, for example. That's very, very important to me, and we want to capture all of that as part of the study.
And do you feel there's a lack of trust in authorities, in statutory agencies, and I don't just mean criminal justice or security agencies, but perhaps in other statutory agencies too, for people to confide in or to raise their concerns, not just about specific extremist behaviours, but perhaps other risk factors that might leave people to feel isolated and become vulnerable?
I think we are witnessing growing distrust in our state institutions, in our wider democracy as well. The Commission has begun an ongoing review of current academic literature into the harms of extremism, and I have to say the evidence is quite limited, but what the evidence is showing us is that the harms of extremism is resulting in social exclusion, isolation, the breakdown of community cohesion, a justification for violence, but also a kind of distrust in our institutions. And what I think, particularly for the police and local authority, what concerns me is how extremists thrive in that particular situation, but also how they can drive extremism even further. And so it's quite complex, but this is something that we want to examine as part of the study.
And in your view, rightly or wrongly, and I appreciate it's not specifically in your remit, how much damage to trust is the PREVENT strategy doing in particular communities?
The PREVENT strategy is not part of my remit, as you've rightly pointed out. I do feel that if you engage widely and explain, and if the government explains to people, particularly to those communities who have fear and concern about the PREVENT strategy, and they build trust with those communities, there will be greater support for PREVENT, and that's really important. Trust, and I've heard this again from youth workers in Manchester who said to me, that trust is really important, but also going and speaking to communities and explaining what PREVENT is, showing how it's there to safeguard children, for example, is really important. But having that engagement is crucial.
Why has that not happened yet? Because this has been said about PREVENT for a number of years, that it's about safeguarding vulnerable young people, but it's not the perception of a number of these communities. So why is it taking so long and proving so difficult to build that trust?
I think that's probably a question you'd have to ask the Home Office and the government.
What are you hearing from communities as you go around the country?
Well, I mean, interestingly, when I've been going around and speaking to hundreds of people, it's interesting because I know PREVENT is a very important and lively debate at this moment in time, but when I've been speaking to people, actually the vast majority of people aren't speaking to me about PREVENT. They're actually talking to me about extremism, the harms that they're experiencing, how they feel it's radicalising young people, and I just kind of feel that, you know, I understand the importance of PREVENT, but I feel that we have to just take care and to consider that we don't go so much down the PREVENT discussion that we ignore the wider context of extremism and how extremism is increasing and is having a negative impact on the lives of people in this country and on our society as a whole.
And when you were appointed, there was criticism from a number of quarters to the effect that you were too close to the Home Office and that you wouldn't have the confidence of communities whose trust you would need to deliver a strategy effectively. How would you reassure people who have those concerns and suspicions?
Well, I think there's two things there. I think the first is the independence question. Prior to my role, as I mentioned earlier, I was director of a counter-extremism organisation. I criticised government when I didn't agree with government policy, and the best example I can give is actually the government's counter-extremism bill. I gave evidence to the Joint Committee of Human Rights, making clear my opposition to that bill because of freedom of expression concerns. But likewise, if there has been a government policy that I feel is right, I will support it. And so the need to have a PREVENT strategy, whatever flaws there are, is about PREVENT. The need to have a PREVENT strategy at a time when the terror threat is unprecedented is a strategy, an approach and a policy that I support. That's the approach I've taken with government in the past, and that's the approach I will take in the future with the Commission. In terms of wide engagement with Muslims in this country, as an activist, I've spent the last 25 years engaging with Muslim voices and particularly with young people and Muslim women whose voices we often don't hear. It's usually community leaders' voices we hear, and I've spent a lot of time speaking to people like that. I wasn't shocked by that response that I got to my appointment. I was disappointed, but I wasn't shocked because when I was director of Inspire, I learned pretty quickly that if you challenge extremism, if you defend human rights, if you advocate for gender equality, you will experience backlash and abuse. And so some of the criticisms I got were from people from that same quarter. But what I would say is that over the last couple of months, I have been speaking to, I've been engaging with Muslims across the country. I've been speaking to Muslim teachers and academics and civil society groups and women's groups and imams. I mean, I was up in Liverpool recently where I spoke to 10 imams from 10 different mosques. And also, I would also just highlight that I've spoken to the breadth that exists amongst British Muslims. So I've spoken to, on the one hand, very conservative and orthodox Muslims and imams, but also I've spoken to liberal and progressive Muslims. I've engaged with ex-Muslims. I've spoken to a whole range of different voices, including minorities within the minority of Muslims, such as the Shia community and also Ahmadiyyas. And so I take that engagement very seriously, but also to point out that I am engaging across the board with different faith communities, those with no faith communities, because that's important as my role as lead commissioner.
And you mentioned earlier the expert group that you've set up to advise and challenge the work of the Commission. Does that include people who have previously been critical of your stance?
There are people on there who are critical of the counter-extremism agenda. So people like Peter Tatchell, for example, he was part of the Defend Free Speech Alliance. He was very critical of the counter-extremism bill, as was Lord Anderson. I mean, he sits on there as well. I've chosen people who, again, both supporters and critics, who will advise and challenge me, but also who bring the whole breadth. You know, if I'm calling for a whole society response, I want people on there who are going to understand that wide challenge. So people like the Chief Executive of ISD, Sasha Havlicek, Jamie Bartlett, who specialise in online extremism and technologies, people like Sundar Kutwala of British Future, who understands the overlap between integration and extremism, individuals like Sir Mark Rowley, who looks at the overlap between extremism and terrorism on the other spectrum, and then again academics who specialise in human rights, women activists like Pragna Patel, who's been at the forefront of campaigning against fundamentalism and extremism as a whole for the last 38 years. So I've thought very long and hard about the group of people I want to advise and challenge me, and brought who I think some of the best minds to that table who will do precisely that, who will advise and challenge me.
And finally, can I ask, do you feel you've got adequate resources to lead the Commission and conduct the research and the work that you wish it to carry out?
I think for this first initial year of the Commission, I do have enough resources. I do hope you'll ask me this question next year when I have to put recommendations to the Home Secretary and, of course, a budget about what I feel the future Commission should be. And I think that question will be a very important one when you ask me next time.
Stuart MacDonald.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming here once again today. Just to follow up on a couple of points that Kate Green asked you about. David Anderson, I think, was on record at one point as saying that he never really understood the intended purpose of your post. Why couldn't the Home Office just do the sort of thing that you're doing and assemble a panel of experts and produce policy? Why do we need a commissioner?
It's a good question. As you will be aware, the government published its first ever counter-extremism strategy in October 2015. I do feel the threat from extremism has evolved since that time, and I believe that the government felt it's good to have an independent person to look at this issue and also to bring a fresh pair of eyes. I don't think it's any surprise that extremism is a very complex and challenging issue. We are seeing a rise of extremism, I would argue both far right, particularly a far-right extremism. And so I actually think it's helpful and better for the government if they do have an independent voice who can advise and criticise and review government's work. So I'm keen to assess whether the government's counter-extremism strategy is effective. Is it making a difference? Is the government's definition of extremism helpful or not? Is it working? And so these are things that I want to consider as part of the study to ensure that we do have the right response to extremism.
You've mentioned that one of the reasons why you think this post has been established is because it brings independence, but as Kate Green said, one of the criticisms that's been made of your appointment is your perceived lack of independence from the Home Office. Now you've addressed that as best as you can, but the other sort of line of criticism that came forward at that time was about whether you had the necessary expertise for the post, just in terms of you don't have an academic background in this field or haven't conducted any research yourself, and some actually, I think in a letter sort of suggested that there hadn't even been a proper credible impact assessment of the work that you'd done with Inspire. How would you respond to those criticisms?
Independence, again, I've answered that question. I think the reason why that point kept coming up, and again, I think it's from people who don't actually know about the work that we've done. I mean, over 10 years, Inspire only had one project that was funded by the Home Office, and that was in 2015, an anti-ISIS Making a Stand campaign. And over 10 years worth of work, I think I find it interesting that people think that somehow doesn't make you independent. We know the Home Office over decades have funded NGOs over supporting vital work such as FGM campaigns or child sexual exploitation, a whole range of different issues. Nobody seems to question their independence because they've received a bit of funding from the Home Office. On the issue of expertise, well, again, I would push back. You know, I've run and co-founded a counter-extremism organisation for the last 10 years. I've written a book about extremism. I've seen firsthand the tactics that extremists are using. I've written extensively about extremism. I've spoken to and delivered training to groups like Ofsted, and to deliver training to around 5,000 teachers across the country. So actually, I think my expertise speaks for itself, and anybody who actually looks at the work I've done over the last 10 years will know that's the case. I can't remember what your last point was.
Can I? But but could I ask you about the panel that you've appointed to sort of provide independent criticism? Now you've explained why a lot of those appointments are made and the expertise that they bring, but I think the point that we were trying to get at was whether or not you'd included in that any of the sort of groups who had been, or individuals who had been critical of your appointment as well, and would that not have been a sensible move if you've not done it?
The expert group is there to provide a very particular need and service to the Commission. I have already met a number of my critics already. I'm more than happy to do so. I've written to many of them quite early on in my appointment saying I'm more than happy to talk to you because I believe in engagement. I believe that, you know, if you have a disagreement with somebody, bring them round the table and have that discussion. And I've seen, and this really matters in terms of the counter-extremism space, because when I've spoken to former EDL supporters, for example, and they've said that when I did sit with a Muslim and had my views challenged, I realised actually I can be swayed. And so I want to set a very important stance in saying that, you know, lead from the top and to ensure that we have that wide engagement and engage with our critics. I've held a number of workshops, for example, with free speech campaigners, human rights campaigners and organisations like Amnesty and others who are concerned about this area, some of whom may have been concerned about my appointment as well. But again, I'm more than happy to engage with them. But I think the expert group plays a very specific role in terms of advising, bringing their expertise to the table, because again, this issue is very complex and I want to ensure I have the best brains at that table to ensure we do try to address and reduce extremism in our country.
Okay, and the final question then is, how free do you feel to set your own agenda? And in particular, prevent seems to be off limits for you. Doesn't that sort of undermine the work of the Commission? I mean, that's central to this whole area of policy, and yet you're not able to properly include it in your study.
I think that's a very important question. The Charter outlines our independence. We have the authority and the power to meet who we want, to set whatever questions we want, to ask whatever questions we want, and to publish whatever we like. Prevent is obviously part of the government's counter-terrorism strategy. My role is counter-extremism. But obviously in the real world, we know it's not so black and white like that. Clearly, in some cases, extremism will lead on to violence and terrorism. My feeling very much is that we also need to just step back and ensure that we are looking at that wide spectrum of extremism. I am concerned that we do often get bogged down around the terrorism issue, and yes, of course that's important, but there is a wider spectrum, and I don't think we do actually understand the wider harms that extremism is having in our country, and so stepping back and ensuring we're looking at that properly is important. As I mentioned, I know there's a lively debate about prevent. My concern is, and I talked about the academic review we're doing, what we found so far is there is very limited evidence on extremism. There's insufficient research about the scale of extremism, the harm it's having. So I'm seeing a gap where we don't have enough evidence. We don't have enough evidence that's highlighting the scale, the harms, what's effective, what's not effective. Yet at the same time, we're seeing rising extremism. So I think for me, my focus has to be addressing the wider challenge of extremism, which I think for quite a long time we have not looked at it properly and sufficiently, which includes looking at the government's work, which includes reviewing the government's definition of extremism. And so I think that's quite a sufficient and significant amount of work that needs to be focused on first and foremost as my primary role.
Okay, thank you.
Look, it wasn't your decision, obviously, to rule prevent out of your remit, but isn't it a bit ridiculous? I mean, your remit includes to identify and challenge extremism in all its forms and provide the government with advice on the policies needed to tackle it. Well, how can that be possible if one great chunk of government policies that's designed to tackle it is off your agenda? And if you've got to engage widely and be prepared to work with those committed to confronting and responding to extremism in their communities, well, for a lot of those people, actually the issue of prevent is at the heart of what they're trying to do, either positively engaging with it or being troubled by it. I just don't see how you can do your job if prevent is excluded.
I agree with you. I think it's confusing and complex. I find it confusing when I speak to people on the ground. They find it confusing. You're right, I've not set that. What we have said is that in the short term, as part of the study, what we want to look at is what lessons can we learn from prevent. That's something that we're keen to do as part of the study. In the long term, I want, as part of me putting recommendations forward, this is one of the issues that I want to be considering and to put forward. But as I mentioned earlier, when I have been going around the country, most people have not been speaking to me about prevent. Ordinary people have actually been wanting to speak to me about extremism. But I agree with what you're saying. I think it is confusing, but this is something that I do want to consider and I will put forward as a recommendation.
And if you had to think about one thing that you think the government is doing best on counter-extremism and one thing that they're doing worse, what's the best thing and the worst thing that you think the government is doing at the moment?
I have to say it's quite a mixed bag. So when I speak to local authorities and councils, they are very supportive of the local community coordinators that are in post, that are working with local civil society organisations. Some have said to me that they found the role that they play is invaluable. The funding that the Home Office provides to the BSBT funding, the Building a Stronger Britain Together funding, which I think now funds around 230 organisations, civil society organisations, I think that is a good thing. My concern is, as I mentioned earlier, that strategy was put together in 2015. I think the threat from extremism has evolved. I'm not sure whether the strategy that was written then is appropriate for the time now. Is it addressing the challenges? How much of that work is actually countering online extremism? The scale of which is just, I can't even describe the scale of that. But also, are we doing enough in terms of actually countering extremist narratives and ideologies effectively enough? So I think there are certain questions that I certainly have, but there are certainly some good practices, but I just feel we need to just ensure that that strategy is fit for the time and the place and the challenge that is now in front of us.
Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Chair. Just there's been a lot of questions and discussions about the criticism you and your appointment have received. If say at the end of your term in office, those criticisms still exist, has your time been a failure?
Well, I've already been meeting critics, and I've already been having constructive discussions.
So do you think you're changing opinions?
Well, some people who are critical have met me and said they're very keen to get involved, to submit evidence to us. That's very important to me.
That doesn't mean you've changed their opinion, though.
No, it is, because if people are saying they don't want to engage with me, And now they're saying that we want to engage with the Commission, we want to work with you, we want to submit evidence, we want to organise roundtables for you to come and to speak to people in our area. That is changing minds and attitudes. And so,
but if you can't, will your time in office have been a failure?
Well, let's see what happens.
But if that is the outcome?
I think we have to be very careful on who we're basing the criticisms from. You know, one of the points I've made before is that just because we shouldn't necessarily take the view of those who shout the loudest. Anybody in public life will always have people who are critical of them and people who are supportive of them. That's the nature of public life. All I know is that I have a very important and serious job to do. Looking at extremism, we are working to engage widely, including with critics. We are working on bringing much more evidence to the table about extremism and helping and encouraging people to work with us. That's my agenda. That's what I'm planning to do. And if people have criticisms, by all means, that door is open. Please engage with me. Submit evidence to me. I want to have that dialogue and discussion with you.
Do you think social media platforms are contributing to the normalisation of hate and extremist views?
I am deeply concerned about online extremism that we're seeing. I know this committee, I know the chair in particular has highlighted things like national action videos, which is still not being taken down. Of course, illegal terrorist content has to be taken down. My particular concern is extremist content which is legal. So on the one hand, we have issues like the Darren Osborne case, which his trial showed that he had been consuming legal extremist content by groups like Britain First and others, and how that was a motivating factor for him. He'd consumed a significant amount of that content. Now, that content is legal. On the other hand, we've got, as Sir Mark Rowley mentioned on the Today programme on Friday, how if you put into YouTube and Google UK Muslim spokesperson on YouTube, the top 4 searches is Anjem Chowdhury. Again, at what point does that encourage somebody to take that step into extremism because they're being exposed to that material? There are other examples where, I don't know if you recall, Tommy Robinson, after the Westminster Bridge attack, he went to Westminster Bridge, filmed a very inflammatory video, and that video received millions of views in the space of 72 hours. There's been research by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue who undertook a piece of study where they examined 162 public Facebook pages of extreme right-wing groups and found that around 40,000 people were actively engaging with that group, and thousands of whom were putting up extremist and hateful content. The scale is actually mind-boggling, and I'm not sure if the tech companies and the social media companies genuinely do understand the breadth, the scale, but also from our part, understanding that we have a challenge where extremist content is currently legal. How do we address and challenge that issue?
That's an excellent answer, and I appreciate that. But do you think social media platforms have to accept responsibility, and do you think they do? Do you think they do?
They do to some degree. You know, we have seen some change. We've seen how Facebook have employed 3,000 more people, but I think there's a lot more that they can be doing.
And I don't know, did you hear the evidence session prior to yours?
No.
No. So there was some, from the Assistant Commissioner, some very positive comments about the progress that has been made, but still more to be done. Would you agree with that?
With the tech companies?
With social media companies dealing with this type of images and videos, and particularly because I'm not sure I'm on the same page, and I think the Chair alluded to this as well as the Assistant Commissioner, about the companies working together to tackle this.
I mean, it depends which content and imagery you're talking about. We know, and the Security Minister has highlighted this, that they have improved and got a lot faster in taking down illegal terrorist content. My concern is the extremist legal content, which is the threshold is not high enough for it to be taken down. Are they doing enough to address that, whether it's taking it down or whether it's devising new technology where there's a better response to challenging conspiracy theories or fake news or disinformation campaigns, which are the bread and butter tactics of extremist groups? I don't think they are. Are they doing enough to ensure that we have better conversations on social media? We've had some interaction with them already, and they're saying that this is something that they are wanting to look at. So I support that, but we want to continue to have a productive conversation with them. And I guess one of the reasons why I want to do the study is to try and gather the evidence about scale and harms in particular, to show them, here is the evidence, this is what the evidence is telling us. For you to turn around and say, we're not going to take this seriously, is no longer sufficient, because here is the evidence.
You mentioned conversations there twice, and in one aspect it was about better conversations with the social media companies, and I understand that, but you also said better conversations on social media. What do you mean by that?
So my staff have been having some helpful conversations with them, and how...
No, sorry, I want to focus a bit about better conversations on social media.
So this is something that some of the companies are now looking at. So, for example, Twitter. We see, for example, how you could be on Twitter having a conversation with somebody, and a perfectly legitimate, healthy debate, and then before you know it, a third person has jumped in and has just turned that conversation very, very toxic, where previously two of you have been having quite a healthy debate. My staff have been speaking to staff at Twitter about how do you prevent things like that from happening, to ensure that that debate is not toxified. How can we try and ensure we have better conversations online? So I know that they are looking at this. That's something we encourage, that's something we applaud, we want to see that. I mean, this is a much more wider problem than extremism, because I think this is a much more wider societal issue.
Okay,
but that's something we need to see more of.
At the more very individual element of this, in terms of extremism, is it better to remove these images immediately before people see them, or is there a case that actually allowing them to be on social media, for these conversations to exist, for people to see how outrageous they are and how they are deplored by the majority of people, there is an element of usefulness in that?
That's a very difficult and complex question, because if that content is legal, we have to be mindful of freedom of expression, legitimate freedom of expression in our country, and we know that freedom of expression is a cornerstone of our democracy. That includes the right to mock, to ridicule, to offend. So that's a very difficult question. I think you have to look at it on a case-by-case scenario. So I can't answer that question unless there are specific examples. But I think that's a very important point you've raised, and it's something that I'm certainly going to consider.
Thank you, Chair. I won't ask the question of whether you think that a man over the age of 40 who had had run a think tank and had written a book on extremism would have been asked, had their credentials questioned in the same way. But I suspect that most of the panel would guess at the answer. I actually wanted to ask you about what you said in terms of the way, the black and white way in which that counter-extremism, counter-terrorism can be defined. Are you keen that your work gets into what you seem to be suggesting is the artificiality of that division, and whether you believe that division is in itself dangerous?
I've obviously come from outside of government, so when I started the role and I saw that, for example, the government has an integration or a proposed integration strategy, the government has a counter-extremism strategy, the government has a counter-terrorism strategy, I was very clear from the start that I want to look at the issue of extremism with a very wide lens. And for me, the interest that I particularly have is the overlap between integration and extremism, and the overlap between extremism and terrorism, and of course, and the wider extremism space. So, you know, I'm keen to ensure that we do look at that, and to ensure, because I just feel if we don't look at it that way, we aren't really going to understand extremism properly. We have a lack of consensus about extremism in our country because we aren't looking at it through that wide lens, and that's not helping us in developing the robust response to extremism that we need. So I've taken the approach that you need to have a wide lens to look at this issue and to, again, look at those two grey areas of overlap.
I guess kind of related to that, were you given a reason when you took on the role as to why formally Prevent was hived off from it?
I can't remember. I think it's because the Commission came out from the counter-extremism strategy and from the counter-extremism unit.
It was a siloed thing rather than an intent
so.
beyond
but
that.
I'd have to check and I can...
No, that's fine. you talk about the whole societal approach,
Yeah.
and I just wondered what you thought about this place and
About
how
Parliament.
and how Parliament is geared up and the conversations we have. I mean, you say you weren't shocked, you were disappointed. I have to say I was shocked by the reaction from some of the people, prominent people in this place, to your appointment. Do you think there is a problem with the way that counter-extremism is discussed within Parliament?
I mean, I think there's two issues there. There's a wider civility issue,
Yes.
and also, you know, I know we're talking about Parliament, but when I go and speak to people in towns and cities across the country, how people are describing to me increased division and polarisation. I went to one very multicultural city, which I won't name, where they even said where actually different Asian communities used to live together quite peacefully. Now the division between Hindus and Muslims, Muslims and Sikhs and so forth is just at another scale that wasn't there 30 years ago. So I think we are, as a whole, both I think in political discourse but also in our communities, seeing that greater division, that extremism can thrive in that climate, it can also drive that climate. So I think there's a wider question about civility. What's happened to our civility? Where has it gone? How can we reclaim it? I do feel that there is a very hostile climate around counter-extremism. As I mentioned at the beginning, I have been really dismayed and upset to hear the experience of counter-extremists in the sense that the bullying, the abuse, the lack of support, and even people who I know support Prevent. I mean, I know Prevent's not my remit, but when I've spoken to imams, for example, or women's groups who say they support Prevent, but they say to me, but you know, Sara, I'll never say that publicly, because if I do, I know I'm going to get so much abuse. There's no space to even say, well, actually, as a Muslim, I do support Prevent. I know there are people who don't, but the fact that people feel they can't even express support for a counter-terrorism strategy, or even say, look, you know, I can't openly talk about this, I think that's really disheartening. And I've spoken to, obviously, a number of academics, and again, academics have said to me, yes, I want to share this information with you, but please don't put my name down, because I know if I talk about this, it's going to have a very negative impact on me, and I'm going to experience bullying, backlash and abuse. This is academics. This is a country where we support academic freedom, and academics are telling me that I get abuse, and on the other hand, we're getting death threats from extremists.
You've had Britain's first female Muslim cabinet minister, Conservative, the same colour as the current administration, the same party as the current administration, criticising you for being too close to the government. That's a problem, isn't it?
I've had a very constructive conversation with Baroness Warsi. I reached out to her after my appointment. I've had a very helpful conversation with her. Clearly there are lots of things we agree on. There are issues around extremism we disagree on. That's absolutely fine. I think, you know, Baroness Warsi had never met me prior to those comments. So, you know, I like I said, I'm very keen to engage and to have those conversations and to try and bring more people together around what is a very important topic.
My final question was just about how much of a challenge you find it, and how you are trying to overcome that challenge in having that conversation within conservative Muslim circles who may still be highly male dominated, and how much of an issue you find that.
It's probably the same when I speak to Orthodox Jewish communities as well. I don't think it's any particularly different with regards to Muslims. It's fruitful. I have to say it's constructive, because when I'm speaking to imams, whether it's in Portsmouth or Liverpool or Manchester or others, when you open up that conversation, I often feel that there's not a safe space for them to talk about it. And when you talk to them, they'll say to you, yes, you know, on the one hand, where our mosques are being targeted by far-right extremists, but on the other hand, you know, we do know we have a problem of religious extremists and hardliners who are trying to radicalise young people. It's been amazing how, having won their trust, they are telling me about religious hardliners and extremists within their own communities, how they fear that they are powerless against the internet in radicalising their young congregation. And then them saying to me, we want help, Sara. We don't know how to deal with this, and we wish we could have more imams coming together and looking at this issue and supporting each other. So those conversations are very important to me, but I also think it's very important for them to come and say, this is a long-standing problem, and we need support, and we need better ways of addressing it.
Thank you.
Just to pick up the point you raised about people's fear of bullying when it comes to trying to speak out in terms of counter-terror work. Why do you think that is happening? Do you think that is a direct consequence of the difficult debates around counter-terror, or is it happening for some other reason and is then just feeding into the counter-terror work?
It's probably a combination of different things. I mean, these things are never a black and white answer. The fact that the lack of civility is a problem, is an issue. I see how that and the way we talk to each other and the very abusive climate now we all live in does impact that. When I'm speaking to people, they are making quite clear to me that there are those whose interest it is in not countering extremism, how it is extremists themselves who are at the forefront of ensuring that they close down the debate, that they deliberately attack, abuse and create a climate where you don't want to do this work. That's the overriding message I've heard over the last couple of months. So there's on the one hand there's the wider problem, but I think on the other hand there is an organised active lobby of extremists and extremist sympathisers where they know it's not in their interests to have counter-extremism or counter-terrorism work because it's fundamentally in opposition to what they stand for.
But in fairness, there are also lots of people who fully support counter-extremism work but have significant and perfectly reasonable problems and challenges with prevent as well.
No, I agree with that. You know, I mean, I have concerns about different aspects of counter-extremism and counter-terrorism. That's why I oppose the counter-extremism bill. But that's that. But they don't necessarily contribute to the climate of abuse and intimidation. And the chilling impact on freedom of expression of certain people. That's, so I agree with what you're saying. But if the question is about the abuse and the direct harassment and the horrendous tactics that I hear about, including death threats, that's coming from a very particular lobby whose interest it is in not countering extremism.
But in terms of, sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, and again, it goes back to the point of this is the climate that counter-extremists or those involved in counter-terrorism are operating in. The sad truth is a lot of them are operating on a shoestring. A lot of charities don't really have counter-extremism funding streams. There's very little recognition of the importance of this work. So funding is poor, resources are poor, many of the organisations I've spoken to are pretty small. Yet we have this huge problem of growing extremism, and on the other hand, we have counter-extremists who are struggling with resources, are operating in a hostile climate, and don't feel they're getting the support. And even with organisations that have been around for a significant amount of time, I was quite amazed at, we put a workshop together and brought a number of them around the table, how they felt just sitting together in the same room and having that conversation was so fruitful because they find it's isolating work, it's not easy, and everyone has got a criticism and it's very personal and abusive, and that climate really worries me, and I want to look at what more can we be doing to support counter-extremists who are doing such vital work at such a difficult time.
Okay, great.
That's not what you're saying. Forgive me if you can challenge this, but it feels a bit anecdotal. What's the evidence of rising extremism? What's the evidence of this bullying behaviour? Could you give us some really specific examples of where it's coming from and how it manifests itself? And what, in your assessment, are the most effective interventions to tackle it?
So there are a number of different indicators that are telling that there's rising extremism. Firstly, when I've gone around the country and people are sharing with me those experiences are very real. So when local councils and authorities are telling me about the increase in number of far-right marches, for example, or for example how Ofsted will tell me that since 2014 the number of books that they are finding in particular faith schools which are advocating stoning, execution, or promoting homophobia.
Are you able to publish those numbers?
So this is part of the evidence that we want to gather as part of the study to try and build that entire picture. And of course, when I'm speaking to academics, one of the things that we found from the ongoing review into academic literature that they cite there's rising and increasing extremism, but obviously aren't able to indicate to what extent. And then there's wider polls around. The BBC, for example, did a poll which showed that 73%, I think it was 3/4 of the British public feel that we've become increasingly more divided. Hope Not Hate have done research which has shown there's concerns around that division. But just the types of incidences we're seeing, and particularly with far-right extremism. I mean, I believe we're at the beginning of a new wave of far-right extremism in this country. I speak to, again, experts and practitioners on the ground, and they are deeply concerned about how, where initially we thought the far-right were declining, that decline has now gone into reverse, again, because of online, but also because of the repackaging and the new breed of far-right extremism we're seeing, how they are how they've become modernised, they've become professionalised, how they are misusing and deliberately adopting the language of human rights as a cover for their extremism. And now the reach that they have, I think this is a significant problem. And of course we're seeing this across the world in many different countries. I don't think Britain is immune, but I think that we need to understand that we are seeing growing extremism. On the Islamist side, we understand that there is growing activism around Hizb ut-Tahrir in places like Bradford, Birmingham, Stoke-on-Trent, who are targeting young people. They'd slightly dipped over the last couple of years. They are now making a resurgence. So on both the far right and on the Islamist side, there is clear evidence and signs that we are seeing a resurgence.
And are you gathering, or have you gathered evidence of effective strategies to tackle it? So
this is what we are looking at. As part of the evidence, that's very much the fifth theme, the response. What is the government's response? How are others dealing with it? One of the key issues that I want to look at is also the current legal toolbox. What measures do we currently have in place, and are we using them effectively?
And are they working? Is that one of the questions you're asking?
Are they working? And are we using them effectively for the time and the era that we're living in? But there's a whole range of different issues, and we want to speak to counter-extremists, think tanks, academics, for them to tell us, you tell us what's working, whether it's a very local civil society-based example, an approach, which some have shared with us, to much more larger national schemes, to online initiatives. That's something that we're very keen to collect, but also to understand what doesn't work. I think it's very fruitful to also know what doesn't work in countering extremism. If we're going to spend lots of money on it, we need to ensure that we're not spending it on projects that aren't having an impact and aren't working.
John Wilcock.
Thank you. It's interesting you mentioned looking at the legal toolbox just in your last answer. And I wanted to ask you, given you are clearly really alive and interested in exploring further the interplay between non-violent extremism leading to violence, and you mentioned Hizb ut-Tahrir, why did you then oppose the idea of a counter-extremism bill, and is your view on that open, or do you remain of the view that that is a bad move?
Hizb ut-Tahrir have clearly stated they don't support violence. They're very much in the non-violent extremism space. So that is quite difficult, although their wider preachings and their views, I think it's quite clear that they are extremists. I want to be very much driven by the evidence. I want my view now is obviously going to be different to my position in 2015, because what I want to do now is to collect all the evidence. I want to understand where the gaps are. I want to understand things like the Darren Osborne case to see if there are legal gaps. At the moment, that's the stage where we're at, where we're collecting that evidence to examine it. So that's probably a good question to again ask me next time once the study has come out. Because at the moment I just don't know whether is it a problem that we have the legal powers in place but we're not using them effectively, or is the problem that we actually do have gaps in our legislation? And so that's again something
you thought you knew the answer in 2015 when you said that the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister was wrong.
Well, from what I was seeing at that point in terms of freedom of expression concerns, I still hold those freedom. My position hasn't changed on that. I still have those concerns around the disruption orders, the banning orders and so forth. And I agreed with people like Lord Anderson on that. So my view hasn't changed about that particular piece of legislation. That may be very different to what we see in the future.
Okay, thank you.
When do you expect to produce, are there any reports or interim reports or responses based on the work that you're doing?
The study we're hoping to publish in spring of next year, but we are hoping to perhaps publish other things along the way and some of the evidence along that journey.
What would you like to be different by this time next year as a result of your work?
I guess greater confidence in people feeling more confident that they understand extremism better. They feel they have the greater confidence to challenge extremists. That we've moved away from, if, for example, and I've heard a lot of this, is that if someone challenges Islamist extremists, they get labelled an Islamophobe, that we don't have that kind of shutting down the debate type of approach. And that people have bought into the counter-extremism agenda a lot more. One of the reasons why I've been engaging widely is because I do feel sometimes is that there is a small group of people involved in the counter-extremism tent.